Welcome to Writers Radio and today's program, Breathing the Page. I'm your host, Carol Harmon. Author, teacher, and writing mentor Betsy Warland lives in Vancouver, but she was born in the U.S. and has lived in various cities across Canada, which gives her an overarching perspective on how today's challenges and shifting values are reflected in the world of a writer. Through her books and advocacy work, Betsy has championed a hybrid form of writing, which she names creative nonfiction. Her work includes book-length poems, a book of essays paired with an interactive website, prose poems, and a popular manual on the art and craft of writing. Oscar of Between, a memoir of identity and ideas, was the basis for Canadian composer Lord Barrett's chamber opera, The Art of Camouflage. Breathing the Page, Reading the Act of Writing is in its second edition, published in 2023 with an additional 10 essays. Betsy reads one of these essays, Narative Position, for this program. Breathing the Page covers aspects of craft, but its scope goes far deeper. The book concludes with, quote, "For me, being a writer is more about learning how to be mastered by craft than about my mastering the craft," end quote. Betsy, would you like to elaborate on this statement?
A little simple question.
And you don't have to answer it either if it's too much.
No, I think I can. Well, as I often say when I'm teaching courses and workshops, there's a zillion craft books out there, so we don't really need more on craft. But something was still missing, and I found myself, because I do a lot of one-on-one manuscript work, a whole variety of writers, from writers early on, just starting to get a sense of maybe they have the beginning of manuscript, to authors who are struggling with their new manuscript. So I found myself having to create some additional concepts, language for these forces that we all wrestle with, that aren't really addressed directly, and sometimes not at all, in the language of craft and the thinking around craft. So if you put those together, traditional craft language and concepts, and the concepts that have arisen in my decades of teaching and writing with these new concepts, it really seems to make a difference. It seems to really be helpful. And it's a fascinating thing, finding the language, because so much about writing it's so funny, it's all about language, but it's so elusive to us. As soon as you think you've got it down and you know exactly how to do this, and what's the term for that? I'm on it, right? Kind of thing. That often will work for a while, and then it needs a different approach. It needs another layer, but you just keep going in that, oh, I'm on it, right? It's definitely a dialogue when we're writing. And there's a lot we don't understand and a lot we don't know. The impetus to write is that curiosity, is sometimes that frustration, is that loneliness. It's been fun to gradually figure out another vocabulary. And I wanted it to be, these essays, I wanted them to be like companions that we could come back to from time to time. Like a real kind of, I can count on this companion when I need encouragement, or I'm really frustrated. This subtitle of Breathing the Page is Reading the Act of Writing. So that's what we're really doing, is having to learn how to read the act of writing more and more deeply, and more accurately, and more humbly, frankly. Yeah, so it's been a lifelong journey.
Betsy reads from her essay, Narrative Position.
I knew from a very young age I did not belong to my family's narrative position, nor to the other narrative positions I observed in my community. Although it has taken me decades to understand the reasons for my displacement, I've always recognized an array of people who have not belonged to their narrative position into which they were born. Sometimes their displacement has been on the micro level of the family and the assigned gender into which they were born. Other times, it's been on a macro level of community, race, country, even global level. And for some, their disjunctive narrative position has been both micro and macro. In my observations over the decades, a disjunctive narrative position has not been a matter of choice, but rather a matter of circumstances. When considering narrative position, we commonly describe it in point of view terms: first person, second person, and third person, limited or omniscient, linear. In addition, we also take into account the very nature of the narrative itself. Is it linear? Nonlinear? A fluctuating combination of both linear and nonlinear? Is it contradictory? Resistant to being told at all? Wrestling with itself? Intensely associative? Distrustful of the reader? And if it's the writer's inherited cultural storytelling differs from that dominant culture's storytelling, how do they navigate this interface? In my 75th year, I am writing this essay to track my journey with recognizing and defining my narrative position in each of my books, but also with other writers I have taught, mentored, or edited, who wrestle with how to evoke the narrative position in each book they are writing. I suspect that the majority of writers' narrative positions differ from the norm, just as Dickinson affirmed. Quote, "Tell all the truth, but tell it slant." End quote. Accuracy and authenticity of the narrative position is what makes a reader passionately stay or distractedly drift away. It's that simple. And it's that hard to do. We have to figure this out with every piece we write, whether it's a poem or a 1,000-page novel.
There's this whole shift in understanding gender and how we express that. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are, how a writer deals with that.
Yeah. It was a really big breakthrough for me and Oscar to finally come up with a pronoun that was a fit for me. I found myself having to, when I was asked about this, or I needed to identify myself in various situations, I would have to use 4 to 5 different words, to kind of cover the whole thing. And I was getting really weary of it and annoyed, not at others, just annoyed at the kind of narrowness of what we expect from one another, to signal, right? So when I was flying to London, England to celebrate my 60th birthday, because I'd gone through a very difficult time of a breakup of with my partner, and my son at that point was 7 years old, going back to Saskatchewan with his birth mom. So I was very at odds, let's put it that way. And on the way, on the plane flying back over to London, I decided I wanted to use the same form I used with Bloodroot, Tracing the Untelling of Mother Loss, which was a memoir, and it was a whole new way of working formally on the page. I decided I wanted entries, which is kind of like a journal, but it wasn't a journal at all. But it had that kind of concept of, it could be a sentence, it could be several pages, it could be a poem, it could be prose. What came to me on that flight was not only did I want to use that form again, but I also had this experience prior to that flight, and then soon after I was in London, and running into this name Oscar and feeling very drawn to it. I decided to take it as a second name, Oscar Between, Oscar. And so then the book eventually became Oscar Between. But the cue of identity, gender, became what I came up with was person in between. Mm-hmm. So now I'm shortening. I'm a POB. I'm a person in between. I just started to do that recently, just for the fun of it. But it's kind of fun. So person in between, and that happened to me when I was in London the first few days, and several things happened that made me get it. And it also had to do with me going to the Imperial War Museum and discovering how the invention of military camouflage changed everything, and how now in our world, everything is camouflage. Now, we have no idea really what's true and accurate or not anymore. Everything is camouflaged. I didn't want to be camouflaged. I'm not good at it. And so I decided to start referring to myself as a person in between. And then when I got that in my own body and mind, I started recognizing other people in between while I was in London for all kinds of reasons, age, race, gender, all kinds of reasons. I suddenly just started noticing them. I thought, I think that's a person in between too. Oh, I think that's a person in between. Often in the bus or in the tube or whatever.
Yes.
And then things would start to happen where there would be little exchanges, like where something happened in the bus in a conversation between two people, a mother with her child, something funny outside. And I started to feel comfortable in smiling or nodding or just recognizing with other people that they were also people in between. It took away a sort of separation screen. Not that I understood everything about them at all, no way, but that there was a position within society that we share, that we're always having to navigate, that being a person in between. It depends on location, who, when, all those things. It made me feel so much more comfortable in the public world. I could read something from it. Can I read something from it?
Yes, please.
In Oscar's daily life, when encountering someone, it goes like this. Some address her as male. Some address her as female. Some begin with one and then switch, sometimes apologetically, to the other. Some identify Oscar as a lesbian and their faces harden, or open to a momentary glance of arousal. Some know they don't know and openly scrutinize. Some decide female, but stare perplexedly at her now sans breast chest. Some are bemused by, drawn, or relate to her androgyny. And for some, none of this matters. Oscar's only desire, to be present to herself and them. On turbulent days, unpredictable with reactions, Oscar longs for simplicity of camouflage, yet has no instinct for it. It would only put her at odds with who Oscar is. Then she brightens. Oscar, person in between, notices another response from others of between. Curiosity.
So there's no easy answer to this, is there?
No.
No.
And that's good.
Yeah, it's a process.
Yeah. And it's a state of being present and flux. It's always, they're always happening. Flux and the more we can be present, the more of value being present offers to us and others, each other.
Let's return to Betsy reading from her essay, Narrative Position.
Within my own writing, and not infrequently when I work on other writers' manuscripts, the narrative position differ or shift more than we anticipate, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically. I am going to describe very briefly how this happens in 4 of my books. My 6th book, The Bat Had Blue Eyes, 1993, was a poetry and prose book-length narrative unearthing a familial secret that profoundly shaped my relationship to what narrative is and how it's maintained. It began while I was writing at a retreat to finish an operatic play I had been working on. It began itself, elbowed out space for itself. This is how it began. 0 characters. A story observed, obscured. A girl invisible. A woman haunted. A writer's work. In the visible. This time, there are witnesses. I continued to work on my play, but this perplexing narrative frequently hijacked me. It gradually became evident that I was investigating how our hidden familial incest profoundly shaped my relationship to the act and nature of narrative itself. After writing several of these pieces, I began to understand that I was writing the narrative in 3 voices, 3 perspectives. The girl, the woman, the writer. These 3 narrative positions occupied the narrative autonomously, but were aware of each other and the reader. This was the book that enabled me to recognize that although I draw upon my lived experience in my books, I am on a lifelong quest to understand the nature of narrative itself. For narrative shapes everything. In another book-length poetry narrative, Only This Blue, 2005, the narrative structure happened so organically that I wasn't even aware of it until well into the first draft. Sometimes the story was told in first person, sometimes second, other times third. In this case, these were all emanating from me in the same real time. This narrative was about a difficult, life-threatening illness, and my relationship to this experience oscillated between intimacy, disassociation, and isolation. Each poem sequence embodied its accurate point of view. Neither I, nor remarkably, most of my readers were consciously aware of this shifting point of view because it was so inherent, true to the lived experience. The body cowers in bone thinness despite nascent fluidity of dappled light, avoids new leaf shadows, suddenly clotting sidewalks, spectral chill, ink into blotter. In Oscar Between, 2016, the narrator me unexpectedly takes a second given name, Oscar, which enables her to tell a complex story of familial and societal deception, and Oscar's gender-fluid experience in the public world. Then there's Oscar's body, being not either nor neither, not a fitting in, nor misfit flaunting out. Even the most aberrant group garrisons its norms. It's not between. In my 2020 prose poem collection, Lost Lagoon, Lost in Thought, the narrative position came with surprising certainty when I wrote the first two words of the first poem. Lost Lagoon, number 1. The human is at a loss for words, considers, wonders, is this loss of words perhaps why the human is a writer? The desire to describe something that the human cherishes makes words scatter in all directions like a flock of startled bush tits. The very word cherishes is suspect, passé. Okay, the human thinks again. Let's begin with its name, Lost Lagoon. Even its very name is a conundrum. How can one misplace a lagoon? Standing on the shore, any passerby can observe it's not a lagoon, but a small lake or perhaps a pond. Over the decades, the human has walked around the lagoon chatting with various companions, but now dwelling close to it, lives with it. The difference between around and with. The difference between pointing with a camera, voice, or index finger, and standing still, watching, listening, sniffing, occasionally speaking softly, or returning a bird's call. Just across the street from the high and low-rise buildings, cheek and jowness, Lost Lagoon life is, once again, the human is at a loss for words. The lagoon resists being depicted, summed up. The human admires this. By the sixth poem, I realized that I needed to address the reader about my odd narrative position. In life in and around Lost Lagoon, it's likely that the human is not perceived as she, he, or I. In the natural world, we are awkwardly, self-consciously, even dangerously, the human. When I chose a second given name, Oscar, it was pivotal. It enabled me to find a term that finally fit, quote, person of between, end quote. This, in turn, enabled me to investigate my core societal concern about our rampant, massive societal deception, paranoia, and violence that is literally destroying us. These two names, Oscar and the human, aren't fictional devices. They signal accurately my narrative position. They acknowledged the particular keyhole for me, the writer, and subsequently the reader, to look through and engage with the idiosyncrasies of each narrative. When we seek out and trust the specific narrative position of a piece of writing, we invite the reader right inside the body language, mind, and heart of the narrative.
You were given the persona of the human, and you've written from that point of view.
Yes, the human just came to me the first two words of that first prose poem. And I didn't know I was writing a book at that point. It was just writing. Yeah, capital T, capital H. And it really felt not only accurate, but it was a relief in a sense to just say, yeah, I am the human. My very presence, sets into motion all kinds of feelings and thoughts and physical response, et cetera, So I just think there's a fluidness, I should say, in all of this. Social media, et cetera, the fluidity is becoming more and more talked about and embraced. I think that's good. Because I think it's accurate. I think that we all are more fluid than we convey and present to others on the whole. I would just say, with a writer who has that happening in the work, but it doesn't quite know how to navigate it, see if you can just, in this case, if it's sometimes, let's just talk about gender, or it could be, race, settler, indigenous, although use the bouquet of who we are, don't feel like we have to choose one. The reader will navigate that. It'll be clear in terms of, because it's going to be familiar to them in terms of their bouquet. And it's also trusting the reader more, that the reader can follow that and can recognize its authenticity and its truthfulness. I guess what I'm saying as a person to between, be comfortable with whoever you are to be between. And for me, I most often want to say a person in between, but sometimes I have to do the gender thing. Whatever the narrative you're in, let's say as a writer, to be able to embrace and signal those variety of positions.
Right.
And not feel that it has to be a choice of one, because there we are again. Because as soon as we have one choice, we're in opposition, right?
That's right.
So it's an opportunity, actually. Get us out of that polarity.
So where are your, I know you're very busy with teaching and mentoring, but where are your thoughts in terms of your own writing?
The main focus has been for me, which I'm very fascinated about, it is writing an essay about the difference between narrative and story. And they're very different. And I've been fascinated by this almost unconsciously for a long time, and more consciously in the last, I'd say, 10 years or so. So I'm trying to explore that in terms of my sensations, my experience, my ideas about it, through some reading of that they're different and what makes them different. And I'm more drawn to narrative than story. Most of the time, we're trying to always translate narrative into story. And so one thing I'll say is that, which I'm very concerned about, is everything has become storyized, huge in terms of online stuff, huge in terms of commerce, huge in terms of politics, huge, it's everything, everybody, it's a story, this little story is like the keyhole in which you look through at all of life, and you want to be seen through all of life. Is that little keyhole? Is that the story about me? I am da 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 da. That's what I'm working on. It'll be an essay. It's not going to be hugely long, but probably a bit longer than the ones I wrote in Breathing the Page. Story has become manipulated. It's it's become quite a dangerous thing. There's also my own Buddhist practice, etc. I feel like this investigating and honoring narrative is really important for me as a writer and as a practitioner of Buddhism. It's a spiritual thing as well as a personal, political, social thing.
Is there anything you'd like to talk about?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is Writers Radio, and I just love what you're doing. And I love that it's the voice. Being a writer, whether you ever get published or you've got 40 books out, you're always learning. It's a big learning curve. You never get it all together and get it right and, okay, I've got this. Got it, got this. I think that must have come from baseball. I'm not sure. If you want to write well, and if you want to satisfy and challenge and embrace the reader, it's never ending. This process, it's never ending. And we wouldn't want it to be, really. But you can get to sometimes with a body work where you've got a bit of a kind of balancing thing, like a teeter-totter and two people on one other side, and you could just get the perfect balance. And you've been honest to the narrative that you've been given to your best ability. Then you put it out there, however you do that. But as a reader, and I think really good readers are also very interested in the act of writing, and a lot of them are writers of various types. It's core. That's all I can say. It's core. And so I just want to encourage people who are listening to Writers Radio, and I think a lot of them are avid readers, a lot of them, I think, write in one various ways or another. That it's a quest that we're on, and then it's supporting each other in that, and sharing our learning in that is really important. So thank you for what you're doing. And it's a lot of work. I know. Yet I just love how inventive and increasingly, technically, et cetera, that it's a very live entity. And so I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
And the human voice.
One of the reasons I think we got into it in the first place was to tap into that oral tradition.
Mm-hmm,
and, I'm old enough that I remember radio because
yes.
my parents were late adopters of television. I was 30
yes.
before. I'd never seen a TV, and I remember sitting by the fireplace and listening to programs on the radio while my mom did the ironing and stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah, they're so powerful and so focused.
And all the nuance in the voice, right?
Yes.
And the nuance, the timing, right?
Yes.
In terms of how that all those things were intriguing. Yeah, I grew up. I think we got a television when I was 9. I can relate. It's a remarkable instrument, the human voice.
You have been listening to my conversation with author, manuscript consultant, and teacher Betsy Warland, as well as Betsy reading her essay, Narrative Position, from the second edition of Breathing the Page, Reading the Act of Writing. Betsy Warland's books are widely available from bookstores and libraries. Visit her website, betsywarland.com, to learn how to work with Betsy. My thanks to Betsy, my fellow producers, and you, dear listeners, for joining us on today's program, which is also a podcast on the Writers Radio website or wherever you get your podcasts.
You have been listening to Writers Radio, a non-commercial collaborative project which presents talented writers reading their own work. These stories, essays, and conversations revisit the long tradition of oral storytelling that connects us to the inspiration behind the words. Be sure to check the website, writersradio.ca, to subscribe to our free notifications list. It's also a way of letting the writers know you are there and appreciating their creative work.
Writers Radio broadcasts from Half Moon Bay on the Sunshine Coast in Canada, traditional tribal land of the Sechelt Nation of the Coast Salish peoples. We express our gratitude for their wisdom teachings and land stewardship.